So you've learned a shape, 2 or maybe 3 shapes of the pentatonic minor, and you've already started to improvise, but you're noticing a couple of strange things when you go to bend some of the notes. Sometimes it sounds good, sometimes it doesn't sound good. So we're gonna take a look at which notes you can bend and how high. Okay, so let's take a look at shape number 1 of the pentatonic. We'll do it in the key of A minor. So there's our first shape, or first pattern. There's 3 strings we're gonna look at bending. It's gonna be the G string, the B string, and the high E string. How do we know how high this note should bend? Should it be a half step, or should it be a full step, or should it be a step and a half? Well, what we have to know is we have to know where the next note in this scale is. Because what you're doing when you're bending is you're actually taking this note. In this case, it's a D note, and you're bending it until it sounds like that note, which is actually an E note. And in fact, there's a bending exercise that I get all my students to do, which has them play the note that we want to achieve, and then immediately after, bend the note. And that'll help you with your pitch. So how do I know that that note is the next in the scale? Well, you have to know the next pattern beside the one you're using. So if you already know how to do pattern number 1, you have to learn pattern number 2. Pattern number 2 will tell you where the next note in the scale is. And we can see that it's right here. So that's a full step and not a half step, and that tells us to bend a full step. Okay, let's take a look at the B string. So the B string, we have a note on 8 here. We know from pattern number 2 that the next note in the scale is here on 10. So that tells us to bend a full step. Again, if you can't tell if you're bending a half step or a full step, just do the ear check, the pitch check, hit 10, go back to 8 and bend it until it sounds like the note we just hit on 10. That brings us to the high E string. Now the high E string, it also has to go up a whole step, and that's because the next note in the scale is on 10 as well. Now the high E string is a bit different. It's one of the highest tension strings. That means that it's gonna fight back a bit more than the rest of the strings. You have to put more effort into bending this string than you do the B string or the G string. So it's a pretty difficult string to bend, especially a step. Okay, so we're gonna bend that a full step. Make sure you kind of get under the string a bit and press down against the fretboard nice and hard and bend it a full step. So the first pattern is pretty easy. We just have 3 full step bends. We can also do a blues curl on any of the notes in the pattern. And a blues curl is a 1/4 bend. It's very, very tiny. It's half of a half. And just to give you an idea, a half step bend is making this note sound like this note. A 1/4 bend or a blues curl is even half of that, so it's not really measurable. So we hear a lot of blues curls in blues and rock, and the sounds and looks like this. It's a very small bend. And we can do that blues curl on every single note. Let's move over to pattern number 2. So for pattern number 2, what we're going to do again is we're just going to look at the G string, the B string, and the high E string. Now, unfortunately, to know how high to bend those, we have to know pattern 3, because we have to know where the next note in the scale is. So let's take a look at pattern 3. If you haven't learned it already, I'll do a very quick run through of it. says pattern 3, and learning and knowing that tells you the next note in the scale from pattern 2. So, for example, if we look at the G string note in pattern 2 on 9, we need to know how high to bend this. Well, it's actually a step and a half away. That means that this note has to be bent a full step and a half, which is a very high bend. If you have old strings or you have a crappy guitar, you're probably going to break a string by doing that. But that note there in pattern number 2, a step and a half. So if you're practicing pattern number 2 because you're not used to it, because you're probably used to pattern number 1 and comfortable there, if you're practicing number 2 and you try and bend that note and you notice it doesn't sound good, the reason is because it has to be a step and a half bend. Okay, so try that on a backing track. Take that note, bend it a step and a half, and it'll sound a lot better. Here's the next bending note that we're going to do in pattern number 2. It's the B string 10. Now, unfortunately, this one also is a step and a half bend. Why is that? Because the next note in the scale is 13. So we take this. It's not too hard to bend this a step and a half. It's not as hard as if we had it on the G string or the high E string, which is extremely difficult to bend a step and a half on a high E string. So this note actually sounds pretty cool when we bend it a step and a half. If you've ever learned the Jeff Healey version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, this is one of the opening bends of the guitar solo. Okay, let's go to the high E string. So the high E string in shape number 2 is the only one that we bend a full step. Now, you're probably already doing this. This is extremely popular in a lot of blues rock. Now, other than just bending that note, I want you guys to experiment with the other strings. So make sure you bend that full step. A high E string, step and a half on the B string, step and a half on the G string, and that gives us 2 patterns to bend with. Let's look at one more pattern. Pattern number 3 is actually another very popular pattern for people to play in, like B.B. King, Eric Clapton, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and of course a lot of rock guys are using patterns 1, 2, and 3 quite often. So once again, here's pattern 3. Now, just like before, in order to know how high to bend the notes, we have to know the next pattern beside. So the next pattern is pattern number 4, and if you haven't learned it, it looks like this. Okay, so let's start with pattern number 3, the G string 12, just a straight up full step bend. So if you bend this, just remember that if you want to hit the next note on the G string, it's going to be 9. And actually, this is a really cool sound to bend this, because not a lot of people bend this note in pattern number 3. Okay. Here's the next note on 12. It's also a full step bend. So a nice bend on 13, not 12, 13 to 15. So those are 2 great bends that you can do. They're not too hard. They're just a full step. Finally, 12 on the high E string is a step and a half bend. We have to make it sound like 15. So I don't know if I'll be able to make it up to it. I might break a string, but we'll see. This is what B.B. King does a lot. He does a full step and a half bend on the high E string. And it can be very tough to get up to that full step and a half because of the tension of the high E string. So those are the three patterns and how high to bend on the G string, B string, and high E string. Remember, of course, that you can do a blues curl on any note in any one of those patterns. You also might have noticed that there is no half bends at all, okay? So in the pentatonic scale, there are no half note bends. There's only full step and step and a half bends. If you want to do some half note bends, and they do sound really cool, you have to look at the diatonic scales like the A minor full natural scale or the C major scale. Both of those patterns will have half step bends, and I will be covering those in a later video, and half step bends do sound really cool. So don't forget to practice this. Take each pattern, put on a backing track, try the bend out, do some improvising, move on to the next pattern, force yourself to stay in that pattern without moving to your comfort zone. Practice some stuff with the bends, okay? Move on to the next pattern and repeat. And make the bends that you have here part of your practicing habits until you become very comfortable and you know exactly how high to bend each one of those notes.